Christopher Columbus brought civilization to this island on Sunday, October 28th, 1492. Not one native survived the first 100 years of Spanish domination. The island is Cuba. Its strange heritage is violence.
Before revolutions succeed, regimes fail. In 1959, Fidel Castro entered Havana victorious. But the Cuban Revolution did not begin in the mountains. It began much earlier. Corruption, instability, and crisis. To understand why the revolution succeeded, we must first understand why the old order collapsed. Because by the time Castro marched into power, the regime of Batista was already rotting from within. Now, before we can understand all of this, we do have to look at Cuba's history. Cuba formally gained independence from Spain in 1898, but sovereignty came with conditions. Following the Spanish-American War, the United States occupied Cuba and amended the Platt Amendment into its constitution. This meant that Washington now has the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. This shaped the early Cuban Republic. Political power became intertwined with foreign influence, economic dependency, and elite patronage networks. Cuba's economy revolved around sugar exports, heavily tied to the American markets and American investors. By the mid-20th century, U.S. interests controlled large portions of Cuba's sugar production, utilities, railroads, and banking sectors. On paper, Cuba was a republic. In practice, it was a state vulnerable, whether it was to military interventions, elite bargaining, or economic inequality. Political instability followed. Between 1933 and 1952, Cuba saw repeated governmental turnovers, coups, shifting coalitions, and institutions never fully stabilizing. Civilian rule existed, but it was fragile, and within this instability, one figure rose repeatedly to prominence: Batista.
The country needs a strong man. It is a part he loves to play. For 7 years, he remains a soldier, ruling Cuba by controlling the army. By 1940, Batista is no longer satisfied with ruling from behind the throne. With the backing of a bizarre coalition of splinter parties, including the communists, Batista becomes a candidate for the presidency.
We can see that Batista first emerged in 1933 during the Sergeant's Revolt. It was a military uprising that overthrew the existing government at the time. Though not immediately president, Batista became the power behind the scenes. The puppet master, the one controlling the armed forces and influencing civilian leadership, all while being in the background. In 1940, however, he did win the presidency through elections and governed constitutionally for 4 years. Cuba even adopted a progressive constitution under his leadership. But when his term ended in 1944, Batista stepped down and moved to Florida, while still maintaining his influence from abroad. During the late 1940s, Cuba experienced growing corruption, gang violence, and political factionalism under successive governments. And this is when Batista sensed his opportunity, returning in 1952.
Soldiers and Marines under Colonel Batista have begun their attack on the National Hotel and the ex-officers quartered on the upper floors.
It's March 1952, 3 months before scheduled national elections. Batista launches his coup. He suspended the constitution, cancelled the elections, and seized power without a vote. There was minimal resistance from the military, civilian institutions folded quickly, the United States recognized his government within weeks. This moment was decisive. Elections were postponed, opposition voices were censored, political opponents were intimidated, jailed, or silenced. From this point forward, Batista ruled not as an elected president, but as a military strongman. We can see that under Batista's second rule, Havana did flourish, but not equally. Tourism boomed. American investors began to pour money into hotels, casinos, and infrastructure. Organized crime figures even found an opportunity in Cuba's gambling industry. Luxury developments rose in Havana, but outside the capital, it was a different story. Rural poverty persisted. Sugar workers faced seasonal unemployment. Wealth remained concentrated among the elites. Land ownership was highly unequal. Many Cubans saw little benefit from the economic growth advertised by the regime. Corruption deepened the public resentment. Government contracts favored loyalists. Police repression increased. Reports of torture and brutality grew even more common. Economic modernization without political legitimacy creates tension. and Batista's regime lacked legitimacy. It relied on military control, elite alliances, and foreign backing. Political scientists often argue that regimes fall not simply because they are poor or corrupt, but because they lose the belief of the people. By the mid-1950s, Batista's government faced growing opposition from students, intellectuals, workers, and segments of the middle class. Censorship intensified. Repression escalated. Each crackdown widened the gap between state and society. The regime had three pillars: the military, the economic elites, and US recognition, but it lacked the fourth pillar: popular legitimacy and the support of the people. And without legitimacy, even a well-armed state becomes brittle. When a young lawyer named Fidel Castro launched a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953, it seemed insignificant at the time, but it revealed something critical. The regime could be challenged, and once that perception spreads, authority begins to erode.
Within 3 days, Batista's police captured the remaining 120 would-be rebels. One of the last to be taken is their 27-year-old leader, Fidel Castro.
So, as we can see, the Cuban Revolution did not succeed simply because the rebels were determined. It succeeded because Batista's regime was already weakened, whether it was by instability, inequality, corruption, or the fatal decision in 1952 to completely abandon constitutional rule. Revolutions are rarely born in strength. They emerge where states lose legitimacy. And that's exactly what we'll be covering in the next episode, where we'll be seeing how a small band of guerrillas transformed that weakness into a victory, because the fall of the old order was only the beginning.
Radio, despite secret police efforts to stamp out the underground. Castro himself has become a figure of legend in the 16 months since he invaded Oriente province from a small boat. The rebels' actual achievements were few for most of that time, but by mere existence and survival, Castro's force has both grown and exerted an influence out of all proportion to its size.